welcome to another episode of Linux Piper. I'm really excited about today's episode because we're going to talk about something that's going to make your life easier and it's going to save you some time. And I think it's a really fantastic approach to being able to quickly get your environment, your desktop environment, up and running the way that you like it to be. And we're going to do that with something called Ansible. And Ansible's been around for a little while now, and it tends to be used more often in larger enterprises. It's something that Red Hat maintains for the most part. You know, it's free and open source, of course, but Red Hat gives it a enterprise backing and really markets it as an enterprise tool. But what you're going to see today is how you can use Ansible and really tap into the power of Ansible just for yourself, for your own sanity and your own time savings. If you're like me, I don't know. I know a lot of people distro hop. To me, it's practically a sickness at this point. I've been distro hopping for many, many years. It's just something I do. I can't help it. I freely admit that I am a distro hopping nutcase. So I don't know. I probably I definitely don't do it as much today, as I did a couple of years ago. And I always, one thing is I always find my way back to Arch Linux. So it's the distro, some version of Arch, and I run Arco Linux on my main desktop environment. But it's really, I think Arco is fantastic. But ultimately, it's always been some flavor of Arch Linux or Arch Linux itself that I always find my way back to. And I've noticed over the last, I don't know, maybe year or so, I don't really have that urge to distro hop as much anymore as I used to. But one of the real pain points about distro hopping was because I always would have a desktop environment that I really liked. And I would always have, some sort of terminal emulator that I preferred. And, there's always some sort of customizations to the shell, whether I was using Bash, lately I've been using ZSH. There's always certain things that it didn't matter what distro I happened to have jumped to, there were certain things that I just had to have, or certain ways that I just liked the system to be configured. And so one of the big pain points was just going through that process of reconfiguring or reconfiguring. It never ended up being exactly the way that I had it before or exactly the way that I liked it. And of course, you can do some things to make that easier, like keeping all your dot files remotely somewhere, whether it's on an FTP or a Git repository or whatever it happens to be. Sometimes that would make things easier, but you still had to go through the motions of installing a bunch of different software. And not just installing it, but configuring it. So Ansible is something that can really help save time in getting to that state that you desire. Like actually getting to a point where Plasma's installed or whatever environment you want to use. We're gonna be using KDE Plasma. That's my favorite desktop environment, or at least today it is. But tomorrow it might be i3 or who knows what else. But today it's Plasma, and getting to that point where Plasma's up and running. I use Kitty right now for my terminal emulator. Like I said, I really am into ZSH lately for my shell. And so I've put together a playbook, an Ansible playbook, that does a lot of these things for you in terms of installing software, setting up the AUR, installing updates, configuring ZSH, configuring Kitty. I like SpaceVim, so setting up SpaceVim. And really the power here, or the important part, key point here is that I may like these applications and I like certain configurations, but you may want things to be a little bit different, and that's totally cool because this is kind of a template that you can use. Ansible, even if you've never used Ansible in the past, you have no idea what it is, really easy to kind of follow along in the configuration files. It's all driven by configuration. There's no special scripts. There's no special programming that you need to do. You don't need to be a programmer. You don't need to be a DevOps engineer. None of that. You just need to be able to read English, and that's pretty much it. Follow along with the config file. And so this is and I'll put this in the show notes, but this is the GitHub repo that I've set up. And I put together some documentation that takes you through a quick start. I definitely recommend not starting with the quick start if you can help it. Try and go through some of these other items, especially as it relates to customization. Go through, probably the absolute minimum thing that you need to do is change the username in this main.yaml file to match whatever username you're running as. Just to make sure there's no issues there. If you want to pull dot files from your own custom Git repository, just change this URL here that you see on the screen, and it'll automatically pull your dot files every time you run the playbook and put them wherever you want them. I put them here in the projects folder, and then it uses a software called RCM to synchronize your dot files. So really, really cool setup. But you can start with a quick start if you like. Which is just 6 steps, and they're all real simple. We're going to clone the repository, which is this repository here. We're going to install Ansible, update the system, which is optional. You don't even need to do that if you don't want. Change the username, just like we talked about, and run the playbook. And that's it. You're done. It will go through and install all these great applications, and not only install them, but configure them for you. So that really saves a huge amount of time. So what we're going to do next is actually go through a tutorial step by step of essentially just the quick start here. So I've set up a virtual machine, a just vanilla Manjaro installation. So we're going to walk through that so you can see for yourself how easy it is, kind of see what to expect in the terminal while the playbook is running. And I think that'll be really helpful. But certainly there's plenty of documentation here to go through this on your own if you'd like. Like I said, it's really simple. That's one of the big features here, is that this is really a very simple approach to getting something done in a short amount of time. Super efficient, very user-friendly. As you go through this, if you have any comments or suggestions, if you want to make it better, I am not an Ansible expert, as you probably can see. When you go through this, there's definitely some best practices that still need to be implemented, both from an Ansible standpoint and also from a Linux system administration standpoint. So this is just kind of my first take on it. But definitely, if you have some suggestions or you have some updates, just happy to take some pull requests and take a look at those and merge them. There's also a discussions tab here. Feel free to jump in if you have questions or if you get stuck. Always happy to lend a hand. So let's get started. So what we're going to start out with is a super minimal installation of Manjaro. I did install XFCE as the desktop environment just to keep the installation fast. It definitely goes a lot quicker just during the install than, say, installing Plasma with it. So we have a shiny new fresh install of Manjaro. Not much here. If we look at graphics, not really anything there. Internet, there's Midori. Not really the browser that I want to use. Multimedia, we don't even have VLC. Really, really, really basic install, right? So what I'd like to do though is I would like to have Plasma as my desktop environment. I'd like to have Kitty as my terminal, ZSH as my shell. I'd like to have Libreoffice up and running. So normally, that whole process usually takes me like an hour and change. Even if I'm pulling my dot files from a Git repo, it still takes me quite a bit of time to get everything configured and set up the way that I really like things to be set up. And so that's how Ansible is going to help us, because there's really only a few steps to get Ansible ready to go and to run the playbook, which is the file that tells Ansible everything we want to install and how we want to configure things. And so now we're going to go through that process, and you'll see just how simple it really is. Alright, so step one, let's open the terminal emulator, and we're going to clone the Arch Linux Ansible setup project, the one that I have created that we'll be using today, that has all the playbooks and configuration files and everything that we'll need to get this process kicked off. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do a git clone. Really important to use recurse submodules. There are one or two libraries within the repo that need to be pulled, and they basically point, if you're not familiar with submodules, they basically just point to other Git repositories. And so it's really important. If we don't include this recurse submodules parameter, you're going to see some empty folders, and when you run the playbook, it's not going to work. So let's go ahead and clone that. And so now we see a new directory here, Ansible Arch Setup. So let's see what's in there. So there's a README, roles, images. So when we want to run this playbook, we basically want to run this main YAML file. But before we can run it, we need to install Ansible itself. So let's go ahead and sudo pacman-sy and then Ansible. And it's going to go ahead and get it installed. Okay, and we're done. So now we have Ansible installed and we can run this main.yaml. So let's actually look at what does that main.yaml file look like. Not much in here, right? It describes which hosts we're going to run this playbook on, which is just our local host here. Become true, which means that there are some cases where we're installing certain packages and we need to become another user. And then the last part is common. So that's the role that we're going to execute. And there's only one role right now. So if you go into common, it has a few folders here. So we're not going to go through each of these folders, but essentially the two most important folders, tasks and vars. And these are the two that really are important to take a look at. So before we run anything, let's go to vars, and you'll see there is a main.yaml file here. So now I'm using nano because even Vim is not installed yet at this point. The most important thing to change in the var file is the username. You can basically leave everything else as is without changing anything at all and it'll work fine, but you must change this username. If you don't change that, it's going to try and use the home folder for another user, and that's not going to work out very well. So, but if you definitely want to kind of walk through this file. It's very easy to read. It's essentially just option, like install KDE, and then a Boolean value, true or false. That's for most of the settings. You can also choose which web browser you want. So you could put Firefox here, or Brave, or Chromium. I am going to add Libreoffice at some point as well, but for now it's these four browsers you can choose from. So default is Vivaldi. You can install Office. So if I didn't want to install Libreoffice, for instance, I could just simply change that to false. But I do want to install that. So let's go ahead and write this out. And so at this point, we can go ahead and run our main YAML within the roles directory. So how do we run it? Very simple. Ansible Playbook. We're going to pass -k, and -k, uppercase K, lets Ansible know that it should prompt us for the password when it needs to become another user. So we're going to do -k and simply pass main.yaml, so that's the input file that it's going to use, and hit enter. So we're going to type our user's password in, and you're going to start seeing some updates as it goes through the playbook and does its installations. It will update the console here so we know what's going on. Now, the updates part of this process is going to take some time because this is a brand new installation. I've not run any updates on it. So you have an option. You can either run the updates before actually executing this playbook, or you don't have to do that, and you can let Ansible take care of it. It's just going to take some time. So I'm going to pause the video here because this could take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll come back to it. Alright, so we've made some progress. We got through our system updates, and as you can see on the screen, it has gotten through a number of tasks. It's installed SpaceVim, it's gone ahead and installed KDE. We got our web browser up and running. It's installed our terminal browsers. So at this point, it is installing and configuring the Arch user repository. So this also can take a few minutes, just because as there are a few base packages that are included from the AUR, and of course some of these need to be built as it's installing from source. So it's going through that process, and sometimes that takes a few minutes. Now, one of the best features of Ansible is the fact that it can be run multiple times. You can run this playbook as many times as you want. And as each of these tasks are executed, if nothing has changed on your system compared to the item in the playbook, it'll be really fast as it goes through. In fact, I'll run this again as soon as it finishes, just so you can kind of see that, first of all, it's safe to just keep rerunning, and secondly, it's smart enough to know when there's work that needs to be done. In other words, something has changed or not changed. It's pretty good at being able to figure that out in a rather fast manner, which is really cool. And so we'll run this again as soon as it finishes, so you can see how quickly it kind of gets through everything. So really, Ansible, is a configuration state management application. So it's essentially, a playbook is just defining the state you want your system to be in. And so every time you run Ansible and you run this playbook, Ansible is simply saying what's the desired state of your machine and what's the actual state of the machine. And so being able to rerun it multiple times is a key feature that is supported. So you saw that it finished. I went ahead and ran it again, and you notice it's saying OK, and it's in green for a lot of these tasks. That just means that the state hasn't changed between my current system and the playbook, the desired state within the playbook. So if we scroll up here, the first run, you see that it's changed. So it's just letting you know for each of these tasks there was some difference between the desired state and the actual state. And so at the bottom it gives you a little recap, and it said that 31 things didn't change and 27 did. It did skip one item, which I believe was an item for Vivaldi, and there were no failures. So that's pretty good. That's kind of what we expect. So again, not much here. The dot files, it said, did change since the last time we ran it, which is probably just because it pulls from Git each time, and it's probably always going to say that has changed, even though it didn't really change. So now that we've got our first run completed, next thing we want to do is do a quick reboot, and let's see what things look like once we are rebooted. Alright, so I just did a quick reboot. I did pause the video so you didn't have to sit and look at a blank screen. So you'll notice on the login screen I can now select Plasma as my desktop environment. Let's go ahead and log in, see what's new. So there's our wonderful KDE Plasma splash screen. And there we go. So now we have our desktop environment. So no more XFCE. We have Plasma. Let's see what our terminal looks like. So Kitty was one of the things that should have been installed, and sure enough, we see it here. And we also see that the shell has been changed to ZSH. We see a nice little power line theme here. We see, when we do an LS, we see proper colorization of each of the directories. So that is courtesy of LSD, so which is really cool. We also should have our directory navigation. Yep, there we go. So you can see as I type, let's say the user directory, I hit tab, and then it gave me a little navigator, a little drop-down navigator to fill out. So let's say local, and I can just keep going here. It's really nice if you're not really sure what the actual path is, explicit path that you're trying to navigate to. If you're using Bash, you're just kind of hitting, we go to user and then hit tab and to see if it auto completes or not. So this is just a much more efficient way to be able to kind of go through and figure out what the path is that you're trying to get to. All right, so aside from Kitty, I also expect to see SpaceVim. So there we go. So SpaceVim is up and running. SpaceVim is a really fantastic modification of Vim. It comes with a number of different plugins. You can install your own plugins really easily. It looks really nice. So the first time you run it, after running this playbook, it's going to go through and kind of update and install each of these plugins. So let's go ahead and run it again. There we go. So we have a nice clean installation of SpaceVim Vim already configured. Looks really good. So let's see, outside of the terminal, we should also have some Office applications, and sure enough, we have Libreoffice. So that was really easy. We got a lot of things installed and configured that really didn't take a huge amount of time to get up and running. It probably took about 15 minutes front to back, all the way from cloning the repository down to actually running the playbook and the playbook finishing. So really fantastic way to quickly get your environment up and running and keep it the way that you want to keep your machine in a working state.